So my presentation today is titled Building a Center of Excellence for Data Science, and there's actually very, very little data science in this presentation, but it seems actually most people are very interested because it's about how to structure data science at your company from an organizational standpoint. And so we'll talk a little bit. First, let me just describe who we are. So I'm from HCSC, better known as Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Montana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And so how many of you actually are from the local Blue Cross Blue Shield? Do we have anyone? Okay, so we actually have one or two people. I see someone else in the corner over there. So most people don't know that actually the Blues are independently operated. There are 36 different Blues. They're pretty much separate companies, but then there's an association that owns the brand of Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so we are the second largest Blue after Anthem, and we are also the largest nonprofit health insurer in the US. I'm not gonna read these stats to you, but just one thing to point out is we do have around $36 billion in revenue. For some reason, my communications team made me take it off this slide, even though it's listed on our website. So don't ask. So how is data science at my company structured? And so we have what's kind of known as a center of excellence or hybrid or hub and spoke model. And we'll get into a little bit about what that means. But we have a central team, the enterprise data science team, which is a team that I lead, so the hub team. And then we have different teams that are embedded within the different business units, such as the clinical team, the provider and network team, and the service delivery team. So each of these teams focuses on different types of problems that are within their specific domains. And then my team essentially acts as a facilitator across all of these teams. If there are actually new teams that need to be stood up, we actually help them seed their teams. And so we have around about 65 data scientists, engineers, and product managers. So I'm not here to talk about how we structure our teams internally and how we develop data science. One of the interesting things that I've heard is that people actually don't have product managers specifically for data science, which is something that I've seen kind of differentiate us. And so we're also hiring a lot, like pretty much everyone else. So I think these are the three things that I want you to take away from this presentation. The first one is to actually know what the heck a center of excellence is, and we're going to do a poll to see whether you guys think you know what a center of excellence is right now. The second one is to take a really simple framework, and so if you're in the process of building out a center of excellence, how do you actually determine what the center of excellence should focus on versus not focus on? And then finally, what makes an effective versus ineffective center of excellence? So here is the first poll, which is, do you know what a center of excellence is? Okay, so I don't want to influence you in any way, so please do select whatever it actually reflects the truth. So when I actually was offered this role back in July of last year, I would have actually picked D. It's a BS term. So I'm giving you cover to select that option as well. But what we're seeing in both Chicago as well as San Francisco is that most people end up picking B and then followed slightly by A, and then C is generally the last option. But wow, most of you actually believe in Center of Excellences because no one's picked D. Okay, so you have a vague idea. And so it's a trick question. And the reason why I say that, so if you want to know what it is, of course you go, okay, maybe I need to, okay, there we go. Okay, of course you go to Wikipedia, right? What does Wikipedia say that Center of Excellence is? And so I picked three different definitions, and I highlighted the one that I basically think is the right one, which is the middle one, right? Which is due to its broad usage, pretty much no one knows what the heck a Center of Excellence actually means. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's actually okay, right? Because every Center of Excellence needs to look different to actually serve the needs of their specific company or organization. But I think the other two, if you were to ask someone a question on a test, you probably wouldn't take off points if someone wrote either of those two as well. Okay, so here's my definition of a center of excellence. And so I'm not going to read that to you, but it's a pretty ambitious definition. But I think for a center of excellence actually to be successful, you have to do this, right? You have to enable organizational level change. You can't be limited and just kind of deliver on a couple successful use cases. And I think there's a couple key words, and I'll just kind of talk about a little bit. First one is drives and enables. So the center of excellence actually needs to be indifferent between executing something directly when it's needed, and I'll talk about when that you might want to do that, versus giving someone, another team, the ability to go ahead and execute on that, right? So if you aren't indifferent, what happens then is you start getting into competitive situations with the hub and spoke, where the hub is like, okay, we're the best at this, so we should start working on this particular problem, when really it should be a spoke. So you have to be completely indifferent. Second one is organizational level transformation. So you really do have to look across the enterprise Otherwise, you're not really being successful in facilitating understanding what's happening across the company. Third one is just real value, right, as opposed to doing research. And I've seen some center of excellences that are purely research focused. I wouldn't actually consider that a center of excellence. Okay, so, come talk to me afterwards, or raise. There's nothing wrong with research, by the way. I just don't know that it's a center of excellence. Okay, so the next question is, have you ever seen an ineffective center of excellence? So generally speaking, so in San Francisco, the most common answer was a mix of A and B. And then in Chicago, it was B and C. So I'll give you a little bit of time to just kind of answer. So most of you, it seems like Boston is leaning towards, okay, we kind of know what center of excellence is and we think they're effective, which is, I would say, a departure from what we've seen in those two other cities. So we'll maybe have to figure out why afterwards. Okay, so here's a really simplified view of the different organization models that you can have for data science. And again, this is simplified. We'll get into the complex view later. So on the left side, you have a completely centralized data science team. What this means is that there's one large data science team. Maybe they roll up to the head of data science or VP of data science. And then on the other side, you have decentralized, which is within different business units or product units. They each have their own data science teams. And so there are problems and advantages of each of these models. So what I've seen with centralized models is that the largest data science teams I see at traditional companies, I think Fortune 500 non-tech companies, they're almost always centralized. And so those teams tend to have hundreds of data scientists in their organizations. And they're able to get infrastructure. They all have really large data lakes that's on-prem, right? So they don't have to think about cloud. But then what I've seen is that those data scientists are almost completely insulated from the business areas. So they have a lot of folks, really smart folks, that want to solve technology problems, right? So you've got the latest neural network architecture comes down. They're like, okay, cool. How do I build a great? How do I use this? And then they build a great model, and it has no practical business application. So what I've seen at some large insurance companies, one publicized example is with AIG, and they invested $100 million into their science team from 2014 to 2016. And they kind of, at the end, they said, okay, what do we actually have for this investment? And it turned out it wasn't that much. So they blew up that team, and they kind of moved into a hybrid model. And there was another large health insurer, which I won't name because it was not as public, that also went through this fairly recently. So this is a fairly common problem with centralized teams. On the other hand, you have decentralized teams. So they're basically sitting within the business or product areas, and their goals are actually written and passed down from the business or product areas. So which means that they tend to be very much aligned in solving the problems that those product or business areas have. The issue is if you have a small team sitting within a business area, they generally don't have enough money to actually do all the things that require a lot of money. So let's think about what some of those things are. Infrastructure, right? So if you're not in cloud, then can you actually build your own data lake? You probably can't, right? Can you maybe get all the platforms that you need? Maybe you can't. Can you effectively recruit at the number of the data scientists you need? Maybe you can't. So the hybrid model or the center of excellence model really tries to bridge both of these. But of course, there's a trade-off. Okay, so it's not like, okay, this is the best per se, you can just merge them magically. You do need a lot of coordination costs. And we've seen that with my area right now. So that hub needs to basically have people who are dedicated to making sure that the work is going to the right area and that the teams are actually talking to each other. And then you often run to a situation where the hub maybe isn't acknowledged as the center of excellence in reality by the spoke teams. And so that's another situation where this model kind of breaks down. Okay, so I'm curious to see kind of what describes how data science is organized at your company. So this was actually very similar in both Chicago and San Francisco. I would say roughly around 50% of the teams or people that attended picked B, and then around 25 were A and C. But it looks like here it's pretty heavily leaning towards B and C. And so if you had actually asked me maybe what this looked like 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said it would heavily lean towards A and C, right? There were actually very few B, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Okay, wow, so most of you actually already have this model. That's interesting. Okay, so one thing that I kind of mentioned is that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach And how you want to build out your center of excellence, it's situation specific, and I'll talk in the next slide about how to think about that. But on the left side, you've got a bunch of different ways that people generally talk about the center of excellence, right? There's quote unquote federated, there's embedded, there's product-based, there's consulting. All these are actually kind of valid depending on your organization. So really, the way that I thought about it when I kind of said, okay, what should my team do as a center of excellence at Blue Cross Blue Shield was really you actually should select from a menu of options. And so these are all the different things that you can actually place along a spectrum of should this be centralized, right, and run by the center of excellence, or should it be decentralized, basically run by the spokes. And so I'm not going to read this, but then I'm going to get to and talk about how to actually think about where each of these falls. And so, by the way, this is not exhaustive. There's a lot of other things. Okay, so here are some actual examples of what it means to be centralized or decentralized along each of these items. So, for example, execution, a centralized model would be the hub team basically has one intake process and then basically farms out work to the spoke teams. That would be centralized. But decentralized version of that would be the spokes basically do all of the work and the hub only facilitates. So an example of technology would be on the platform side, does the hub determine what tech stack everyone uses? And decentralized would be every team gets to decide what its own tech stack is, right? So, and then hybrid is a mix of those, right? So you can actually be fully along the spectrum for each of these items. So how do you actually decide where you should be on the spectrum for each of these? So this is the framework that I used when I sat down and said, okay, where do we want to be with Blue Cross Blue Shield? So for 4 things. The first one is how mature are the practices in an area, right? So we're actually moving, I would say, towards more maturity in the practice of data science than we definitely were 3 to 4 years ago. We're definitely past the point where an accepted data science life cycle is to go hire some really smart PhDs, hand them some random data and be like, all right, now give me insights, right? That's clearly not something that works. Okay, I don't know why you're laughing. Hopefully that's not what you've been asked to do. Well, you're also research, so maybe it's okay. Right, so there are best practices, around how to actually deliver and operationalize ML solutions. So the second one is how close is something to the actual business or product, right? If something is really, really close, it's operational, then the teams that sit with those operations, sit within those teams, are really going to understand the problems of those teams. So you really want that to be something that's done by the spoke as opposed to the hub. And the third one is scale, which is if something actually has economies of scale, clearly you want it to be something the hub does, right? So an example of which I'll talk about later is like recruiting, right? Do you want all of your 10 data science teams each to go out and recruit data scientists by themselves? And the final is maturity, which is how mature is your organization overall? So if you're at, let's say, a tech company where everyone really understands data science and they understand tech, then you're probably more on the mature side. So your hub, your center of excellence, should actually do a lot less. But if you're immature, and let's say you're a more traditional Fortune 500 company, and you have a lot of people that don't really understand what the heck data science is, then the hub actually should be doing more. So these are the 4 things that kind of go into where should I be on the scale for each of these items. Okay, so here's my take, and I'll kind of skip over this in the interest of time so we can have a little bit more interaction at the end, which is for each of these items I listed, where does it fall along accepted practice? Where does it fall on scale, and how close is it to the business? And then kind of using that, okay, should it be hybrid, should it be centralized, should it be decentralized? And I don't know if you've ever seen the 7 attributes of a citizen data scientist. One of them is contextual knowledge of the organization or something like that, right? That's not something that I have in my company. We've got 24,000 employees. I definitely don't know everything that's going on. So how likely are you going to find an analyst that has that? Second one is you're so good at data science, you're so tech savvy, that you don't need like a hub to actually tell you what to do, because everyone basically knows already how to successfully execute data science. Those are, I would say, those are the 2 situations where clearly you don't need a center of excellence. Okay, so these are, I think, the 3 practical considerations. So these are at a minimum what you need before you should start a center of excellence. So the first one is executive sponsorship. So you need someone from the C-suite who's willing to back you. So both from a funding perspective as well as talking to other leaders. The second one is the head of the COE actually needs to have soft skills, right? They need to be able to manage both the data science stakeholders, who are the other spoke teams, and then they also need to manage the business as well to kind of spread the idea of data science. So what we did was really focus, kind of thinking of it almost like a product, right? What are my priorities, and how do I form a backlog, and then where do I start? So for us, it was specifically because we had to hire over 35 data scientists and engineers. In 2019, the first one that we need to get control was actually recruiting and talent. So what we did was we created a hiring committee, and we also centralized all the recruiting efforts, right? So there's one central recruiting budget. We go out to 10 to 15 target universities, and then we just draw people from the spokes to recruit as needed. But then candidates come through a central funnel, they get evaluated very similarly, or rather through the same standardized process, and then they get to kind of choose a team after they've been interviewed and selected for hiring. And so that was to make sure there were standards for the data science talent that we hired. The second one was actually most of the team didn't even know the other teams. They didn't even know like what the other teams did. So if you went to a random data scientist on the clinical team and be like, hey, what does the financial planning team do? And they'd probably be like, okay, first of all, I don't even know who those people are, much less tell you what they're doing. Okay, so one really quick way is to centrally get people together and then give them free alcohol, right? So when I say build a community of practice, it's really sponsoring a lot of social activities and making sure that people actually know those other people and that they're friendly with them. And so we're actually at a point where the community is really, really strong, right? Every data scientist pretty much knows every other data scientist, even though they're spread out. And if you were to ask them, hey, like what the other teams do now, they could probably tell you that. And then the second advantage of this is that we want people to collaborate. We don't want people to be competitive with each other. And so when you do actually sit down and have a beer with someone, you're much more friendly towards them. You're much more willing to help them as opposed to kind of seeing them as maybe competing or vying with you for work. Okay, so where are we now? So what I've done is I've highlighted, and it can't actually see if it looks gray. Okay, it looks gray up there. It looks like same colors here. Where we are now versus where we would like to be. So I'm just going to talk a little more about this. I'm going to pick out maybe 4 or 5, and then if you have any questions about this specifically, feel free to come up to me afterwards. So I kind of mentioned, first of all, hiring and recruiting, right? So we standardize and coordinate all the hiring and recruiting as the hub now. And we kind of draw people from all the spokes to help us with that. But then it is us that kind of sets a standard. So something like compensation, do you really want to compete amongst yourselves for determining what you should pay your data science talent? Probably not, right? That's really dumb. It also makes you look like you're uncoordinated when you're actually making offers. And I would say pretty much we know what the market is now for data science talent, especially in Chicago because of so many hires. So we do want to make sure that we're consistent there. So technology right now, we kind of subsidize certain tech stacks, but we don't tell what people can use or not use. But we would like to move to a situation where people, let's say, we don't necessarily tell them what they should use because we want to prevent innovation, but it's more like you can't use certain technologies. One example would be, let's say, a non-open source legacy software that has 3 letters that I'm not going to name, right? So maybe you shouldn't be able to use that. So infrastructure is interesting. So people ask me, okay, why do we actually want to kind of maybe move towards decentralized when clearly like infrastructure, if you kind of think at least on the hardware side, you want like lots of power. I think a lot of people are moving to cloud now, and that's true of us as well. And ideally, what you would do is you would have people be able to basically spin up their own containerized clusters. And so in that situation, you want to be completely self-service. If you the problem with having on-prem infrastructure is that it's a multi-tenant environment, right? So it's not only data scientists using it, it's also your kind of IT team, your data team, they're running a lot of ETL jobs, moving data around. And generally the conflict there is that you want to install some great new packages, and they're like, well, you might bring down the environment and we have to run all these daily jobs. And so we're not going to let you, we're only going to let you do it once every 6 months. That's not an ideal situation. So finally, education. It probably doesn't make sense to have every team, let's say, bring in training and do that separately. So we're trying to move more towards a hybrid model. Okay, so best practices once you do have a COE up and running. So I'm just going to talk about some of these. So I think the first one is act like a servant leader. And so really what that means is you should treat your spokes like they're your customers. And sometimes I do see center of excellence and think, well, I kind of have authority. I'm going to come in and I'm just going to say this is how we're going to do things. And I've never actually seen that work out. If you treat them like your customers, understand their pain points, and then try to help them, generally they're much more willing to work with you. So do actively involve everyone in governance activities. So let me just give you kind of an example of that. So we actually have a lot of different, for example, we have a hiring committee. The person that led the hiring committee we actually came from one of the spokes and not necessarily the hub, right? So we just want to be able to share power and make everyone feel like they're involved. And then they're much more willing to kind of work within whatever framework you create. So I heard from an executive that if you say something once or twice, people actually don't think you're serious. They think you're just maybe throwing an idea out there. And so if you're actually serious about something, and this is general good practice, you actually have to communicate it 5, 6, 7 times. At that point, people are not like, okay, this is not just a trend that you're just kind of throwing out and see how people react. You're actually serious about making this change. So whenever we have a change, for example, we talked about implementing a rotational program at the company, we actually communicated that at least 4 or 5 times, and then I also had separate conversations with everyone so that they could express their opinions too. Here's some other practical considerations that people ask. So number one, I hear this a lot, where should the Center of Excellence sit, right? Should it sit in IT, should it sit in analytics, is it in digital? I think this really is kind of an intellectual exercise. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter where the Center of Excellence sits as long as whoever is you report up to has full buy-in into giving you resources, right? Giving you the money that you need to execute on everything. So I talked about this secondly, or previously, which is, should you actually try to have your COE upskill analysts and statisticians? I think we've had very limited success with this. I'll just talk about a situation where we had success, which is with statisticians, right? So they pretty much have already built their logistic or linear regression models. Sometimes it's simply just giving them some basic ML tools that they can go in and upgrade their existing linear logistic regressions to machine learning models. And the principles of it are pretty much the same. So there's less risk that they're going to put something into production that is going to be completely wrong and lose you, $10 million a day, as happened with Knight. So how should you structure the team on your COE? So I think, first of all, you absolutely have to have actual working data scientists, right? So if you don't have people that do data science, it's going to be very hard for them to understand the challenges of the spoke teams. But then the way that we've set up our team is how we would like the spokes to eventually set up their team, which is to have a product manager, to have engineers, and to have data scientists work hand in hand along with analysts. Not all the data science teams actually have all those roles today, but they're moving towards that because they're seeing that on the use cases where we're delivering on, we're actually very successful. So the fourth one is, how much actual delivery should you do? So to give you a perspective on how mature we are at Blue Cross Blue Shield, we actually currently don't do any marketing analytics internally, right? So we're a giant company, we don't do any marketing analytics. And that's actually a huge surprise to a lot of people. But traditionally, we've been a company that has been very successful with large employers, right? So there hasn't been that need to really develop the consumer focused marketing. And so because we have almost no expertise there, that's something my team is actually trying to build up. How do we actually start maybe doing some of the analytics ourselves around marketing? And I kind of talked about the fifth one a little bit. So we're just going to do a quick breakout, and ideally you should talk to someone that you actually don't know. And here's kind of, I've summarized everything I've talked about in one quick worksheet. And so if you do have a Center of Excellence, you can kind of ask, do you have those 3 things currently? And if you do, I'd be curious to know if your Center of Excellence is actually not effective, even with those 3 things. And so we'll break for about 5 minutes, and then afterwards we'll have a quick discussion and Q&A. Okay, so for those of you that are too shy to kind of raise your hand, you can add some comments. Although these are very interesting, so they're apparently about the previous sessions. I do agree, AutoML is pretty cool. So I think I was talking to Josh beforehand. There's a new prototype AutoML package that's being created by Andreas Mueller. It's called Dabble. I don't know if you covered it, and I think he's the number 1 contributor to scikit-learn. So if you want to look into that as well, that's great. Yeah, I do agree. The panel was pretty cool, and of course the Melon impact presentation on trading. By signing up on Wayfair, will they run reinforcement learning on me? Do we still have anyone? from Wayfair to talk about that afterwards. So does anyone actually want to, by the way, just a follow-up, so I met with the folks that had a research COE. They're at Harvard Business School, and so they're trying to do research, so it's probably okay, right? Because they're trying to spread and best practices around how to do research. So who's developing a COE? Does anyone want to volunteer? I don't know if that was him. So let me just kind of break the ice. So when I gave this presentation and I said, if you want to come up to me afterwards and share your problem, maybe I can kind of help you. This is a funny story. So he said, okay, no, we have 2 data science teams at my company, and they're competing with each other. How do I get around that? Okay, and I said, okay, and this is a product manager. I said, how many data scientists do you have on your team? And he said, 1. And I said, okay, I think you have a problem that I can't really help you with. So if you have any funny stories, we can also share that, or I can hand it over to our next speaker. And I'll be around at the reception if there's something that you want to talk in more depth about.
All right, thank you very much.